911, where is the emergency?
And not emergency. Actually on the Belmar Bridge, right after heading south in the middle of the bridge, there's a car that's abandoned.
Okay.
They're advising it's a Sarah's turn. We did get a phone number for her. Her voicemail box is not set up. We are trying to find a better location of where she may be at.
You got a second? Can I come in and talk to you real quick?
Yeah, no problem, boss.
Is Sarah here by chance?
No.
When was the last time you had any kind of contact at all with her? Spend some light, I hope you don't mind.
I mean, we went to get food today.
You have a cell phone you can reach out to her on?
I actually haven't been able to find my cell phone.
Any idea where
I've
it's
been
at?
calling it all day.
I have mine on me, so. All right. Keep looking for your cell phone, man, because we're trying to find Sarah. What was her mindset last time you talked to her?
I just know she's been trying to get away. She told me she's going to Canada.
Trying to get away, okay. Canada,
Her dad is great.
Magatasny may not have expected the authorities to show up on his doorstep as quickly as they did, and it was the middle of the night. But he's got this very scripted response that he's prepared for the authorities, and he's not really showing any emotion. Most people hearing that a dear friend of theirs is missing, there would be a sense of panic or worry. We don't see any of that with Magatasny. What we also learn very quickly is that his phone is conveniently missing. This is a lot of information to be shared for someone who just in the middle of the night had his door knocked on and has just supposedly learned that his friend is missing.
As soon as you hear anything, call the Neptune City or Neptune Township Police Department. Let us know.
You have to work today or you're off?
Yeah, I actually have supposed to have school all day, but I emailed all my professors and they said it's fine if I don't come in this week.
What do you study there?
Psychology. I want to pursue some kind of career in law enforcement.
You do?
Yeah, definitely.
So we appreciate you coming down to talk to us. Obviously, we're very concerned about Sarah. And what's the extent of your relationship?
I would say we're pretty close friends.
Was she ever your girlfriend?
No. We actually have reason to believe that she could be a lesbian. She just seems really, immature. You know, like she's not interested in that kind of stuff.
I think there is an element of victim blaming in some of the narrative he creates for Sarah. I think he's still trying to keep two narratives going. One is that Sarah has committed suicide and or that she's run off to Canada. And he's got to find motives for those. In contrast to how he criticizes Sarah and how he creates this really false narrative about this strained relationship and horrible relationship with her dad. He consistently tries to portray himself as this really nice and virtuous guy to the cops. He wants to be a police officer. He is doing all these things to manage their impression of him.
What time did you hook up with Sarah?
Sometime between 1 and 2 o'clock. And Sarah and I talk about.
Okay. You stayed there the whole time after you went back to her house?
Yeah. We actually went up in her room and played some video games.
You haven't told us about the bank.
Yeah.
How come you haven't told us about the bank?
Well, I told him about the bank, but
Did you you go to the bank?
I was with her. Way back from Taco Bell.
Why did she stop at the bank? What did she tell you she was stopping at the bank?
Something to do for money. I don't know.
When he's confronted about one important detail, this trip to the bank, his answers suddenly become limited, they're monosyllabic, they're one word, and he doesn't really provide any details. He actually rapidly shuts it down by saying, I don't know anything about that. So he doesn't lie to them, he doesn't miss a beat, he acknowledges it, but he doesn't really account for the fact that he left that omission out when he was so detailed and specific otherwise.
So, just hear me out. It doesn't make sense that you would do all these things and you would go out to lunch with her, and on the way back from Taco Bell, you would stop at the bank so she could take care of her money, and then you ask no questions. There's a lot of resources involved here. I want you to make sure that I want to give you the opportunity, okay, to be ahead of all of this.
Mm-hmm. One thing I want to talk to you guys about was if she did jump off the bridge, what are the odds that she's not somewhere all the way out in the ocean back?
Did she tell you she was going to jump off the bridge?
No. If she had told me that she was going to jump off the bridge, there would have been no way that I could have gone to work that night.
There's nothing about that question that seems normal or usual or typical. It's got to raise flags for law enforcement as to whether McAtasney is manipulating them, whether everything he's been telling them is just a lie to try and throw them off the investigation. And really, at a minimum, what they're going to start to look more closely at is his own motivations. And what he's really doing is trying to kind of put the pieces together for them. But what he's also trying to do is see what they know and what they don't.
You're probably wondering where we were going. Your dad is here right now. Your dad came down. Did you tell him that you told him that you were coming down here?
I was coming here.
He informs detectives that he had had a conversation with Mr. McAtasney about a week prior to Sarah's disappearance. And in that conversation, Liam describes how he would choke her out and then dispose of the body by throwing her off the bridge. A week later, this person disappears and her car is found on the bridge. It's tremendously alarming because it seems as if perhaps Mr. McAtasney was sharing his plans.
It speaks to somebody who is far more calculated, premeditated, and manipulative. And while they may or may not have assessed McAtasney in that manner, they now are quite concerned. This speaks to not a 19-year-old who just wants to find his friend, but a 19-year-old who was calculating in every one of his interactions with law enforcement.
Good, man. What's happening, bro? How you doing?
Hiding from the cops.
What happened?
Dude, you can't blame me for doing this, right? I gotta feel you up real quick, alright?
You're good.
No disrespect, okay? I got the FBI on my ass, dude.
About what?
About killing Sarah. They've been, they were up my ass. First it was just normal police. They were on my ass and I had to go in and get interrogated by them multiple times. But then it kept moving up levels and now it's a federal case. so got the FBI.
So you've been laying low.
It's like he's in his element now. He is coming in. He's kind of smirking a little bit. He's kind of proud of himself. And I think he is really, really eager to tell Anthony Curry what he's done. On the one hand, it's bragging a little bit at the beginning. And one of the things that we see here is this kind of grandiosity, this sense that I'm so smart, I'm so important, I'm such a planner that I can do these things and get away with it.
You've been laying low, I guess.
Oh, yeah. And that's not even the worst part. The worst part of it is I thought I was walking out 50 grand, 100 grand in my pocket. She had one safe and she took money out and she only had 10 grand.
So what, do you have it hidden?
Yeah.
Where'd you hide it?
First it was in my house for a long time, but then I stopped trusting Preston.
Yeah, what's the deal with Preston? Did he end up, like, helping you or not?
Oh, yeah. Dude, tonight we just tried to rob a drug dealer together. We were down there. We were gonna steal this guy's safe. And we get to the house, and he moved. He's not at the same house. This is Preston's thing this time. Sarah's whole deal was my thing. But I had planned Sarah's situation for me to be interrogated by cops. Like, that was whole part of my plan, to make me look not guilty.
McAtasney is continuing to talk freely with his friend Curry about what actually happened in the crime. But what McAtasney also doesn't care about is his co-defendant. He now has implicated an additional party, Preston Taylor, who was involved in the crime. And what we also see, classic to somebody with very superficial emotions and connectedness to human beings, is McAtasney has the audacity to not just talk about the crime so freely and openly with his friend and to implicate another party, but he actually has the audacity to complain about the amount of money he ultimately got. He thought this was going to be a big payout of a job, and it wasn't.
Yeah, and the worst part is we threw her off the bridge and the body never showed up. Yeah, and dude, all right, so I'm hanging out with her. She has, we went to the bank, she took some money out, not all of her money. We're counting it out, and then she goes to walk out the front door. I choke her out, drag her. My biggest problem was the dog. And her dog laid there and watched as I killed her. Didn't do anything. Her dog.
Was she, like, screaming? Or you had her so tight that it was like...
She just herself. And
because you lose control of your
said
bowels.
my name, and then that was it. And then she was just laying there having a seizure or something. So then I got a shirt and I just shoved it down her throat so she wouldn't throw up or anything, and held my finger over her nose and set a timer. That's the only time I had my phone. And it took me like a half an hour after I hit start. On the timer.
It's absolutely a dehumanizing description. The strongest emotion I'm picking up is this sort of annoyance. The 30 minutes struck me as something that I didn't really fully understand. The idea that he may have been sort of gathering information for future crimes. This was not the first time that he was going to end up having to do something like this. That's certainly possible.
And I didn't get a lot of money, but I had enough money to just be like living comfortably in my house, tripping, throwing parties all the time. I don't feel any different, and I don't think about it.
You got to lay it out for us as to why it happened, all right, and why he did what he did.
He says that she had anywhere from upwards of $50,000 to $150,000 left to her in cash from her mom. Liam did a pretty good job of convincing me that she had covered everything up. Just went along with it.
The common denominator between McAtasney and Taylor seems to be their interest in money. And there's certainly an antisocial component of that, you know, the focus on the money and an absolute absence of focus on the person involved and the fact that it would entail killing somebody. Hurting other people doesn't seem to be a big reservation.
Can you please explain and demonstrate and show where you were located when you and Liam had thrown Sarah's body over the bridge?
Liam had her by the shoulders and hoisted her up onto the railing, and then I pushed her feet over so that she was going over the rest of the way.
Okay. And are you confident that her body went over the bridge?
Yes.
Monotone, even voice, no emotion, just a flat description, just a narrative. Truly, you know, kind of in line with the way psychopaths experience the world. Devoid of emotion, just facts, just a narrative. If you look at the entire sort of crime as a whole, it was a means to an end. They needed money, this was a way to get money. That money was gonna run out. This would have been repeated had they not been caught, 100%.
I'm going to sentence Preston Taylor to 18 years in the Monmouth County, in the state prison, and that's subject to the No Early Release Act, meaning he will have to serve at least 15 years before becoming eligible for parole.
I told you when we opened weeks and weeks ago that it was going to be shown to you that it was fantasy, that it was an audition, that Liam McAtasney made it up for Anthony Curry, the horror film director.
Consistent with what we see in
What's the address of the emergency?
Yeah, it's on Iron Horse Boulevard. We need a police and an ambulance down here. Somebody fell off the bicycle. They've been there speak like for a while.
They need to hurry up.
Yeah. Hurry up.
Is the person alert and conscious?
No.
Tonight, there are more questions than there are answers surrounding the death of Melissa Milan. Milan was a single mother of two and a senior vice president at Mass Mutual Insurance. At first, police thought she was the victim of a hit and run, but an autopsy revealed something much more. Milan's death was a homicide. The medical examiner says she was stabbed in the chest.
Years later, a Simsbury murder is still unsolved, and now the state's cold case unit is helping with that investigation.
You know, he's making light of a murder, talking about watching cartoons when he's in prison and was making a joke about all the people. He's someone who, you know, he didn't end up confessing until years after the crime. So there's also a level of lack of remorse and callousness for those years, at least, where he didn't confess to it, that I think are striking.
I'm just happy that this
demon, if you want to call that, is released from me. No longer any control over me.
In the name of Jesus, every knee will bow.
Yes, he will, including the devil.
He's talking about the devil and Jesus, and he's really, in that moment, potentially playing to his audience. It's hard to know if this is Leverett distancing himself from any real culpability. It's easier to say something inside of me, some monster inside of me, some demon or devil inside of me did this, because then you don't have to actually take responsibility for the fact that it was your own choices and actions that did this. Or if it's more simplistic than that it's really just about manipulating the people that are lending him support right now and showing him kindness.
All right. How are you feeling right now?
Okay.
A little anxious or?
Well, I mean, it would be hard not to feel anxious, but not too bad.
Sure. Okay. And you want to stay here and talk with me about an incident that occurred?
I'm here to turn myself in for the murder on Iron Horse Boulevard almost 4 years ago. I was living with my grandparents, and that night I came home, and there was nobody at home, and I was a little lonely, so I went out for a walk. It was just to kind of listen to some music, and I saw a woman running, and I don't know what came over me. I had a knife in my car.
Okay.
So I feel like I was acting beyond my own control.
Mm-hmm.
And suddenly I had the urge. I brought my knife with me, and I don't know what came over me. I had just was a new friend to me at the time. I had not told her about my sex offense at the time, and I was afraid that if I told her, she would reject me as a friend.
What we have here is someone that's in anticipated rejection, where at first they blame systems and other people for all the problems that are going on with the individual. What we have, I think, in Leverett is a burgeoning, maybe sexually sadistic psychopath. I think we have someone who has already been willing to violate the sexual boundaries of a child, who's now willing to violate the physical boundaries of an adult, who disconnects himself regularly, probably from his group, probably from his treatment provider, and whoever this new person is that's in his life. The more you spiral through your cycle, the more you're willing to engage in any misbehavior in order to feel confident, in order to feel in control again.
And I was embarrassed and scared, and I figured, well, if I just kill somebody, it'll make all that go away. I won't even have to explain myself.
And this was all because you felt you may be rejected by your friend.
Yes. Who, unknown to me, I did not know if she was attracted to me, but I was very attracted to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I was afraid that she would say no. But first I was just more afraid that she would say no to being my friend.
I'm just trying to understand what got you at that point at that time.
I think it was not the original intent. It was a split-second decision that I did eventually make, that was what I wound up doing. decided I'd turn, and I bumped into her, and I had the knife in my hand, and suddenly it was mostly gone, and when I pulled it out, I realized it was in her chest.
He wants sex. For him, everything about his self-esteem is related to whether or not he can have sexual contact with someone. In his anticipated rejection, it's gotten to the point it can't be consensual anymore. It has to be taken by force. And I think that's why he has the knife. This isn't a behavior he's done before, but it's a behavior he's fantasized about a lot. He didn't realize how delicate the human body is and misinterpreted the timing with which he could use the knife to subdue.
What made you decide to talk to people tonight?
Well, my friend asked if we could take a walk and talk, and she said, "Will, I'm a little concerned about you because of all of your," she said, "you know, you have a tendency to act impulsively, and you have a tendency to do things that put yourself or others at risk without thinking." And she said, "And you don't ever take responsibility. You always blame it on the other person."
What was she concerned about? What were you doing that was impulsive?
Well, just the way I was driving. And she said, "That's the reason I've been driving lately." She said, "I don't feel comfortable driving with you anymore." And so she said, the lies they're stacking up. And she's like, "I don't know if I can trust what you say anymore." And then I say, "Don't want to lie, but, the lies, they happen, if you," and then that's when I broke down. And then, so I told her what happened, and I went into more detail as the evening went on.
So it's almost like she's reading from a checklist of signs of psychopathy, and he starts to get worried about this rejection. So he capitalizes on this opportunity, which makes you wonder about his true intention of confessing in the first place. Was it because he felt guilty or he had some remorse about the murder, or was it simply because he was trying to salvage the relationship and he thought this was a way to do that?
At that point, she was wearing hot pink and black clothing, running style clothes with that had very revealing or that revealed features very well.
When you say revealing, what kind of features do you mean?
Revealed the shape of an attractive female, and showed her hair very well. And I had started having some angry feelings, and I could not have this woman, and I should say that I assumed that she had children and a husband. And so at this point I had started to become a little emotionally unwound, and I grabbed a knife from under my seat in anger. And I started walking north toward that sort of that stop sign ahead sign. I got close to her and I bumped into her so that she would stop, and I drew the knife from its plastic sheath and I stabbed her in the chest.
He's now going back to the scene where Melissa Milan was murdered, and he's reliving the incident. He's reliving the thoughts and moments leading up to it. There's a lot more discussion in this moment about her sexual attractiveness. And it's interesting that the first place his mind went as he's watching this female jogger is not only a sexual interest in her and that she's attractive, but a sexual arousal pattern that sounds like it's activating within him.
I'm trying to lead up to the night. So I'm trying to figure out where your mind was, who you were thinking about.
So I got out of the group, I had a headache, and I was on my way to my car. So I went up into the center of town. I drove along 202 or 10. I intended to be around people, to talk to some people, see some people and their dogs.
There's clearly a sense of entitlement, as well as this willingness to objectify or reduce people, in this case women, down to objects, down to transactional needs. He's not really interested in a deep connection. And that's the fundamental difference between somebody who's able to objectify others and somebody who actually wants to relate to others.
What were you doing for, like, sex? Were you ever since you've been released from jail in Colorado, were you sexually active up until this point?
I had a girlfriend that I met, so going back 2.5 years or so. Apparently I'm not very good at getting aroused.
So the time here before the murder, there was no sexual contact, no relationships,
no.
And your intention to go down there was to communicate with people, to talk to people.
People in general. Well, at this point, I saw a woman that was very, very attractive. Her breasts were very attractive. Her butt was very attractive.
Okay, what were you thinking when you saw her? Were you getting aroused? Or?
I would say I was getting aroused.
And you were wearing gloves, you said, at the time? Okay.
Despite being in his 20s, he doesn't have a very good understanding of his sexuality. He compartmentalizes the opposite sex. He doesn't talk about them as whole people, but he talks about their body parts. But he doesn't talk about them as a whole human being. He doesn't know how to answer the question, and despite saying he's not very good at getting aroused, he then turns around and says he was aroused. So what we see is somebody who has a very troubled relationship with his own sexuality. He has a troubled relationship with his own arousal patterns. It's just not clear that he has any real or realistic understanding of how to relate to women, certainly.
See, and that's where I'm having a really tough time sort of digesting this, I'm going to be honest with you. It's simply this. So you need some human companionship, what you said.
I feel my mindset is that here's a woman that I find attractive and that I can't have her. And that made me a little angry. And then it rapidly progressed to, I'm way out of my league with this woman. I can't have this woman. This woman's probably married. Probably about a bazillion other things going through my mind.
Was your intention to harm this woman?
Harm or scare, I'm not sure which. Maybe just scare. The knife would have successfully achieved that. I don't know if I had the intention of killing, necessarily, but I think I had the intention of stabbing. I was worked up in a frenzy, and my blow is just, I guess it was just, the stab wound was just very good. Like, very, very accurate.
When he says a statement like the stabbing was very good, the stabbing was very accurate, you get the sense that in some ways he's maybe glorifying what he did, that maybe in some ways he's still minimizing or denying the idea that he was capable of really harming this woman. It seems more confident than the Leverett we've seen over the course of these interrogations.
You were angry because here was a woman that may have been out of your league.
Out of my league, too old for me, probably has kids and a husband, is married, take your pick of any reasons that might have upset me.
Had you not seen this attractive woman, somebody that you were attracted to, run by you, what was your intention?
I probably would have gotten bored and gone home.
So essentially he's saying, I would have given up. And what that starts to speak to is really this idea that maybe it is a game for him. Maybe it is a fantasy, that this is all part of a hunt and prey. And when he doesn't get his needs met quickly, because again, we know this is someone that struggles with impulsivity, so he's looking for instant gratification. When he doesn't get it quickly, he doesn't have the stamina to continue.
The scream was never heard, but the silence that followed still echoes through the block, a narrow strip of brick apartments on Chicago's South Side where porch lights once flickered like tired ice and winter wind slid through alleys carrying the smell of rust and old snow. Because on a February night in 1988 a woman vanished without a sound, without a struggle anyone could swear to, without a single witness willing to say they saw her leave, and by morning the city had already swallowed her name into traffic reports and weather updates. Another line item waiting to become a cold case. Her name was Elaine Porter, 34, a clerical worker at a small insurance office downtown, punctual to a fault, known for bringing leftover coffee to neighbors who overslept, the kind of woman whose routines were so predictable that when she didn't show up for work at 8:07 a.m. sharp, the phone started ringing before noon, and by dusk, police cruisers were idling outside her building, red and blue lights washing over the same hallway she'd walked through every night for 6 years, the same hallway where nothing looked broken, nothing looked disturbed, no forced entry, no blood. Just an apartment that felt abruptly unfinished, like a sentence cut off mid-word. Investigators called it suspicious but quiet, too quiet, because Elaine's purse was still on the kitchen counter, keys in sight, coat gone, and the radio was on, low volume, a late-night talk show murmuring to an empty room, the kind of detail that gnaws at detectives because it suggests interruption, not intention, and as officers canvassed the building, knocking on doors, they got shrugs, sleepy faces, complaints about the cold, and a chorus of "Didst hear anything?", a phrase that would later feel less like an answer and more like a verdict. The building itself was ordinary, 4 floors, 12 units, shared laundry in the basement, neighbors who recognized each other more by footsteps than by names, and right next door to Elaine's unit lived a man who had moved in less than a year earlier, quiet, polite, mid-30s. Worked irregular hours, always nodded hello, always paid rent on time, the kind of presence that blends into the background so well it becomes invisible, and on that night, he told police he'd slept through everything, just like everyone else. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and the investigation widened and thinned, friends interviewed, co-workers questioned, an ex-boyfriend tracked down and eliminated, phone records combed for meaning that wasn't there, while flyers with Elaine's face stared out from telephone poles. Slowly fading, the corners curling as if the city itself was trying to forget, and when spring came and still no body surfaced, no ransom call, no credible sighting, the word missing began to harden into something colder, something heavier. Something that sat in the pit of every conversation like a stone. Detectives chased tips that went nowhere, a woman resembling Elaine spotted on a bus, a clerk who thought she'd seen her buying cigarettes, a psychic who claimed water, always water, but Lake Michigan kept its secrets, and the file grew thick with paper and thin with hope. Until budget cuts reassigned the original team, boxes were sealed, and the case slid into that grim category whispered in precinct hallways, the one stamped with time itself, cold case. Years passed, the building changed tenants, paint peeled and was repainted, children grew up, moved out, and still Elaine Porter never came home, her mother died without answers, her brother stopped returning reporters' calls, and in the records room downtown, her file gathered dust. A relic from an era before DNA databases and digital footprints, when silence could still win. But cold cases don't stay cold because there's nothing there, they stay cold because what's there refuses to speak, and in 2009, more than 2 decades later, a young detective pulled Elaine's file off the shelf for a training exercise, a hypothetical review, nothing more. Until one detail snagged his attention, a line in an early report noting a neighbor complaint about repeated late-night noises weeks before Elaine vanished, noises that were dismissed at the time as plumbing or arguments, the kind of everyday disturbances that never make headlines. And the detective started reading deeper, tracing those complaints to a specific unit number, the one next door. By then, the man who'd lived there had long since moved on. A string of addresses across state lines, minor offenses, nothing violent, nothing that would have flagged him in 1988, but times had changed, technology had changed, and when investigators quietly reopened the case, they did so without press conferences, without promises, just a small team and a sense that the truth had been closer than anyone wanted to admit. They re-interviewed surviving tenants, older now, memories blurred but not erased, and something shifted, hesitation where there had once been certainty, phrases like "I guess I did think it mattered," and "I didst want trouble," and slowly, a different picture emerged. Not of a peaceful building, but of thin walls and arguments cut short, of footsteps pacing at odd hours, of Elaine being seen talking to the neighbor more than she'd let on, friendly, yes, but tense, like someone trying to keep a situation from escalating. The neighbor, tracked down at last, denied everything, cooperative, calm, his story unchanged after 20 years, but calm can be rehearsed, and when forensic teams re-examined items preserved from Elaine's apartment, a single hair trapped in the vacuum bag, overlooked, untestable at the time, finally spoke, a genetic whisper pointing to the man next door, and suddenly the headline wrote itself, shocking, simple, devastating, the killer was living next door. Except Elaine's body was never found, no crime scene could be reconstructed, no weapon recovered, just a theory supported by science and circumstance, and when prosecutors debated charges, they weighed certainty against doubt, closure against the risk of losing everything in court. Because a cold case closed on paper doesn't always close in the mind, and as news leaked, the community reacted with disbelief and guilt, neighbors replaying old nights, wondering what I'd ignored, what I'd chosen not to hear. For some, the revelation felt like justice delayed but delivered. For others, it reopened wounds that had scarred over, because knowing the danger was so close, separated only by a shared wall, is a kind of horror that doesn't fade, and even now, decades later, Elaine Potta's name still surfaces in conversations about unanswered questions, about whether closure without a body is closure at all, about how many other cold cases sit waiting for a detail brave enough to speak. On that block in Chicago, the apartments still stand, ordinary as ever, but longtime residents will tell you the air feels different, heavier, as if the past never quite left, as if every quiet night carries an echo of what wasn't heard in 1988. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous secrets don't hide in dark alleys or distant places, they live right next door, smiling, nodding, waiting for time to do their work, while a cold case waits, patient, for the moment it decides to thaw. The problem with reopening a cold case is that time doesn't just preserve evidence, it distorts it, stretches it thin, bends memories until they creak, and as word spread quietly through the department that Elaine Potta's disappearance was back on the table, the past came rushing in with all its unfinished business, because every file note was written by someone who'd already moved on, every witness statement frozen at a moment when fear and convenience outweighed truth, and now, decades later, investigators were asking people to remember not just what happened, but why they chose not to speak. They started with the building, because buildings remember even when people don't, and old maintenance logs told a story no one had bothered to read in full, repeated service calls to the unit next door about plumbing issues that never seemed to get fixed, complaints of water damage, strange odors, late-night access requests to the basement, all dismissed as the cost of aging infrastructure in a working-class neighborhood, but taken together they formed a pattern that felt less accidental and more deliberate, as if someone had been improvising solutions in the dark. Elaine's apartment, long since renovated and re-rented, was recreated through photographs and floor plans, investigators walking the space in their minds, measuring distances, imagining how a conversation might turn sharp, how a door could close without slamming, how a body could be moved without drawing attention if you knew the rhythms of the building, the exact moments when trains rattled past and drowned out everything else, because Chicago is loud enough to hide almost anything if you know when to listen. They pulled old police radio logs from that night, static-filled recordings that captured nothing remarkable, no calls from the block, no reports of disturbance, but the absence itself felt heavy, because silence isn't neutral, silence is a choice, and someone on that street had chosen it. Again and again, while Elaine slipped from the city's grasp. The neighbor's name, buried in the file for years, now surfaced with weight, and detectives traced his movements after 1988, a restless path through rental units, short-term jobs, a life defined by impermanence, yet threaded with small details that raised questions. Restraining orders that never stuck, co-workers who described him as intense, private, easily offended, nothing actionable on its own, but enough to sketch the outline of someone who preferred control to chaos, someone who didn't like surprises. When they knocked on his door for the first re-interview, decades after that winter night, he greeted them with practiced politeness, a man who had learned how to answer questions without offering anything extra, his recollection precise where it needed to be and conveniently vague everywhere else. Insisting he barely knew Elaine, that neighbors were neighbors and nothing more, but the detectives had learned to listen for what wasn't said, and what he never addressed was the tension others now recalled, the arguments behind closed doors, the way voices would rise and then abruptly stop. One former tenant, coaxed into a second interview, finally admitted she'd heard Elaine crying late one night, weeks before she vanished, heard a male voice through the wall, low and angry, words she couldn't make out, and she'd told herself it wasn't her business, because in that building, minding your own business was a survival skill, and that decision, small and human and devastating, had rippled outward for 30 years. As investigators pressed forward, the genetic evidence loomed large, a hair that linked the neighbor to Elaine's apartment, but defense attorneys were quick to remind everyone that proximity explains presence, that living next door means traces travel, and without a body, without a crime scene. Every theory felt like it was built on air, fragile and contested, and prosecutors hesitated, knowing that a failed case would cement doubt forever. The media caught wind of the reopening and descended with cameras and headlines, resurrecting Elaine's face for a new generation, framing the story as a shocking revelation, the killer next door, but behind the scenes, the reality was messier. Filled with legal debates and ethical questions about what justice looks like when the truth arrives late and incomplete, when the best answer still leaves room for denial. Neighbors watched from their windows as news vans lined the street, the same street that had once absorbed Elaine's disappearance without protest, and now, confronted with the possibility that the danger had been familiar, even friendly, they spoke in hushed tones about guilt and hindsight. About how easy it had been to assume nothing terrible could happen so close to home. The suspect maintained his innocence publicly, no confession, no breakdown, just a steady insistence that the case was a mistake, a narrative spun from coincidence and regret, and as months turned into years of legal limbo. The phrase "cold case closed" appeared in headlines long before any courtroom decision, a declaration that felt premature to some and overdue to others. Elaine's family, what remained of it, was caught in the middle, asked to celebrate closure without remains to bury, without a final moment to anchor their grief, and they spoke carefully, acknowledging the evidence while admitting the emptiness that still lingered. Because knowing who might have done it doesn't bring back the years stolen, doesn't answer the question that wakes you up at night, where is she? Investigators, too, felt the weight of incompletion, aware that cold cases rarely end with certainty, more often with acceptance, a collective agreement to stop searching, and as the file was officially marked resolved, it was placed back on the shelf, thicker now, heavier. But still marked by absence, a solution without a scene, a culprit without a confession. On the block where it all began, life continued, new tenants moving in unaware of the history beneath their feet, while longtime residents carried it quietly, a cautionary tale passed down in fragments, about a woman who vanished, about how close danger can be, about how silence can harden into history, and even as the case was declared closed, the mystery refused to settle, lingering in the gaps between evidence and belief. Because in the end, a cold case doesn't haunt a city because it's unsolved, it haunts because it reveals something uncomfortable, that answers can live right beside us unnoticed, that evil doesn't always announce itself, and that the line between knowing and not knowing is often drawn by fear. By convenience, by the choice to look away, a choice made in 1988 that echoed forward, shaping lives, shaping headlines, shaping a story that still refuses to rest. By the time the file was stamped closed, the city had already moved on to fresher horrors, but the detectives who worked Elaine Porter's case knew that closure on paper doesn't mean silence in the streets, because rumors travel faster than facts, and on Chicago's South Side. The story began to mutate, whispered versions trading certainty for suspicion, turning neighbors into characters and hallways into crime scenes, as if the building itself were being interrogated by memory. What lingered most was the question no headline could answer, not how Elaine disappeared, but how she could vanish so completely without breaking the surface of everyday life, and investigators returned to that night again and again, reconstructing hours that had left no mark. Tracing the rhythms of February 1988, a city locked in cold, people indoors, windows sealed, radios humming low, the perfect conditions for something terrible to pass unnoticed. Elaine had been seen that evening at the corner grocery, a bag of bread and milk in her hand, exchanging a few words with the clerk, nothing memorable, just a timestamp anchoring her to the world, and from there the trail dissolved, no credit card use, no phone calls, no sightings. Just a short walk home that should have taken minutes and instead swallowed her whole, and detectives fixated on that gap, the distance between the store and her door, the space where ordinary life turned lethal. They mapped the block, noting blind spots, alleys, the way streetlights cast uneven pools of yellow, the places where a person could step out of view without vanishing entirely, and they imagined Elaine carrying her groceries, keys ready, mind already on the warmth of her apartment. When someone familiar spoke her name, because familiarity disarms faster than force, and if she stopped, if she turned, the rest could unfold without a single scream. The neighbor's timeline was dissected down to the minute, his claims of sleep tested against work records, transit schedules, weather reports, but time is malleable after 20 years, and certainty frayed under scrutiny, because every detail relied on memory, and memory, under pressure, bends. And the defense would later argue that bending is not breaking, that doubt still lived in every unanswered question. What investigators couldn't ignore was how little resistance the disappearance suggested, no struggle reported, no noise remembered, a vanishing that felt procedural, almost practiced, as if someone had rehearsed it in their head long before acting, waiting for the right night, the right silence. And that idea chilled even seasoned detectives, because it implied patience, a quality far more dangerous than impulse. They re-examined the building's basement, a low-ceilinged space of concrete and pipes where echoes distort direction, where sounds travel unpredictably, and old tenants recalled seeing the neighbor there late at night, tools spread out, fixing things no one had asked him to fix. A detail once dismissed as helpfulness now reframed as access, opportunity, a private workspace hidden in plain sight, and suddenly the plumbing complaints took on a darker resonance. Still, without remains, every theory hovered just above confirmation, and investigators debated internally whether they were seeing patterns or creating them, whether hindsight was sharpening truths or inventing them, and that tension seeped into every decision, every report. Because the cost of being wrong was enormous, not just legally, but morally, reopening a wound only to leave it bleeding. The neighbor's life after 1988 offered no catharsis, no dramatic downfall, just a quiet existence on the margins, and that normalcy unsettled people more than guilt would have, because monsters are easier to process when they look the part, and this man did not. He aged, gained weight, developed hobbies, paid taxes, lived in apartments with thin walls and neighbors who would later wonder if Tide shared space with something unspeakable without ever knowing. When journalists pressed for details, officials spoke in careful language, emphasizing evidence without overpromising, but the public heard what it wanted to hear, a simple narrative with a villain and an ending, and the phrase, "killer was living next door," hardened into fact. Repeated until it felt inevitable, even as legal realities remained unresolved, because stories crave closure even when the truth resists it. Elaine's absence became a symbol, invoked in debates about cold cases, about the limits of justice, about the reliability of memory, and in police training sessions, her file was used to illustrate how easily the obvious can be overlooked, how proximity can blind investigators, how a familiar face can slip past suspicion because it doesn't fit the story we expect to tell. Behind the scenes, detectives wrestled with their own doubts, replaying interviews, scrutinizing the hair evidence, questioning chain of custody, contamination, coincidence, because the weight of accusing someone without a body pressed heavily, and they knew that science, for all its authority, does not eliminate uncertainty, it only narrows it, leaving a margin where belief must fill the gap. The community, too, was divided, some clinging to the relief of an answer, others uneasy with the idea that the truth had arrived incomplete, and conversations on the block grew tense, old friendships strained by accusations and defenses, because the past was no longer abstract, it had a face again. And that face lived, or had lived, just a few feet away. Elaine's story refused to stay in the archives, resurfacing whenever another disappearance made the news, whenever another cold case thought, because it asked a question that never loses relevance: how many answers are missed because Thierry too close? Because looking too closely would mean acknowledging a danger we'd rather believe exists somewhere else. As years passed after the case was declared closed, the legal silence continued, no trial, no verdict, just the lingering label of suspect attached to a man who denied it to the end, and that unresolved ending became part of the case's identity. A reminder that justice is not always a clean line from crime to consequence, sometimes it's a fog that never fully lifts. In the building, new tenants slept in Elaine's old apartment without knowing whose footsteps they echoed, while longtime residents felt the weight of shared walls differently, listening more closely, second-guessing every noise, because once you know that silence can hide a crime, it never sounds the same again. And somewhere between the official closure and the unanswered questions, Elaine Porter remained suspended, not alive, not laid to rest, a presence defined by absence, her story told and retold in fragments, in headlines, in hushed recollections. A cold case that was declared finished but never truly ended, because the most unsettling mysteries are the ones that stop just short of certainty, leaving a city to wonder what it missed, and what else might still be hiding next door. Time did not soften the edges of Elaine Porter's disappearance, it sharpened them, turning every unanswered question into something that cut deeper with age, and as the case settled into its uneasy afterlife, detectives found themselves haunted not by what they knew, but by what they could never prove, because proof demands a body, a moment, a clear line between before and after, and Elaine had dissolved somewhere in between, leaving only shadows that stretched across decades. The internal review that followed the case's closure was meant to be procedural, a final accounting, but it quickly became something else, a quiet autopsy of decisions made in 1988, of doors not kicked in, assumptions left unchallenged, and the most glaring oversight of all. The neighbor who was never truly scrutinized because he was convenient to ignore, familiar enough to feel safe, ordinary enough to blend into the background of a working-class building where privacy was currency. Veteran officers revisited the original canvas reports and noticed how quickly the focus had shifted outward, away from the building, away from the people who shared walls and ceilings with Elaine, as if danger had to come from outside, from strangers, from the unknown. Because the alternative was too unsettling, too close, and that instinct, born of human fear rather than malice, had shaped the investigation from the start. Elaine's routine was reconstructed yet again, not because it yielded new facts, but because repetition can reveal what a single pass cannot, the subtle deviations, the moments where expectation meets reality, and one detail kept resurfacing. Her habit of chatting briefly with neighbors in the hallway, a few words exchanged in passing, a social glue that made the building feel smaller and safer than it really was, and that habit, investigators believed, may have been used against her. The theory solidified quietly, without drama, that Elaine had been intercepted at her own door, groceries set down, keys still in hand, a conversation that began as ordinary and ended somewhere no one could see, because violence doesn't always announce itself, sometimes it whispers. And in a building with thin walls and shared spaces, a whisper can vanish into the hum of everyday life. They studied similar cases from the era, disappearances marked by proximity, by perpetrators who lived near their victims, and the parallels were unsettling, not because they proved anything definitively, but because they suggested a pattern that had been hiding in plain sight for years. A reminder that familiarity is often the most effective disguise. The suspect's psychological profile was updated using modern frameworks, not to label him a monster, but to understand his capacity for control, his apparent comfort with secrecy, his ability to maintain normalcy under scrutiny, and the portrait that emerged was chillingly mundane. A man who avoided attention, who preferred predictability, who reacted poorly to perceived challenges, and who, if threatened by exposure or rejection, might choose containment over chaos. Elaine's friends, interviewed again decades later, offered fragments that had once seemed insignificant, moments of discomfort Elaine had brushed off, a neighbor who lingered too long in conversation, a sense of being watched in shared spaces. Comments that felt intrusive but not dangerous enough to report, and these recollections, colored by hindsight, carried a heavy burden of guilt, because each one ended with the same refrain, "We did think it meant anything." As the narrative tightened around the neighbor, so did resistance, legal and emotional, from those who feared the consequences of certainty without completeness, and debates erupted quietly within the department about the ethics of declaring closure when doubt still lingered. When the victim's final moments remained unknown, when the line between truth and theory blurred under the weight of public expectation. The media, hungry for resolution, framed the story as a triumph of persistence, science finally catching up with time, but the detectives knew better, knew that what they had was not victory but approximation, a best possible answer in a landscape eroded by years of silence. And that knowledge tempered any sense of accomplishment, replacing it with a sober awareness of limits. Elaine's case became a reference point in discussions about cold case methodology, about the dangers of early assumptions, about the need to look inward before outward, and yet, for all its instructional value, it remained deeply personal to those who had touched it. A reminder that behind every file number is a life interrupted, a story that refuses to resolve neatly. The suspect, living under the shadow of accusation, continued to deny involvement, and without charges, his life existed in a strange limbo, neither cleared nor convicted, a state that satisfied no one, not the family seeking justice, not the community craving certainty, not the investigators who wanted an ending that matched the gravity of the crime. Elaine's name resurfaced periodically in public forums, online discussions dissecting evidence, arguing timelines, debating guilt, as armchair detectives filled the gaps left by official restraint, and in these digital spaces, the case took on new life, morphing with each retelling. Sometimes accurate, sometimes distorted, but always marked by the same core unease, that the truth had been close enough to touch and still slipped away. The building itself became an unspoken character in the story, its walls bearing witness without testimony, and longtime residents reported an hyper-awareness, a sensitivity to sounds, to footsteps in the hallway, to doors opening and closing. Because once you know what might have happened in a space, it changes how you inhabit it, how you listen, how you sleep. In private moments, detectives admitted that what troubled them most was not the suspect's denial, but the possibility that Elaine's final moments were profoundly ordinary, a misunderstanding escalating too far, a boundary crossed. A decision made in seconds that would ripple outward for generations, because that kind of banality is harder to accept than evil, it offers no catharsis, no clear moral distance. The case file, now thick with addendums and annotations, sat on the shelf as both a conclusion and a question mark, its closed status a practical necessity rather than a philosophical one, and those who had worked it understood that some cases never truly end, they simply stop moving, settling into the collective memory where they continue to exert pressure. Elaine Porter remained there, suspended in that space between knowledge and mystery, her disappearance a cautionary echo about the cost of silence, about the risks of assuming safety based on proximity, and as Chicago continued to grow and change around the block where it all began. The lesson endured quietly, that the most unsettling truths are often the ones that live closest to home, Unsinn und Scheinget, waiting for time to run out. By the time Elaine Porter's name stopped appearing in headlines, it had already sunk into something deeper than newsprint, a reference point for unease, a shorthand for how close danger can sit without ever announcing itself. And in precinct corridors her case was no longer discussed as an active investigation but as a presence, a reminder that some files never really leave the building, they just change the way people walk past them. New detectives assigned to cold case units were told about Elaine in low voices, not as a success story, but as a warning, because the details refused to align into something clean, and every attempt to explain the disappearance exposed another layer of discomfort. Another moment where the obvious had been overlooked because it was too familiar to suspect. The more they studied the neighbor's history, the more they realized how easy it would have been for him to operate without drawing attention, a man who understood schedules, who learned when the building emptied out, who knew which sounds blended into the city's constant noise. And that understanding was not genius, it was observation, the kind anyone could develop if they paid close enough attention, and that realization unsettled investigators more than any dramatic criminal profile ever could. Elaine's last known hours were replayed endlessly in their minds, not as a cinematic sequence, but as fragments, her boots leaving faint salt tracks on the linoleum, the grocery bag cutting into her hand, the familiar creak of the stairwell, details imagined so vividly they felt almost remembered. Because when facts run out, the mind fills the void, and those imagined moments began to feel like memories borrowed from someone else's life. Neighbors who had once been certain of their indifference now struggled with delayed clarity, remembering oddities that had not registered at the time, the way the neighbor would linger in shared spaces, the way conversations sometimes felt edged with tension. The way Elaine's friendliness had thinned into politeness, and each recollection carried the same weight, the knowledge that recognition had arrived too late to matter. Police psychologists noted how common this pattern was, how people reinterpret the past once an explanation is offered, and they cautioned against letting hindsight masquerade as evidence, but even that warning could not erase the feeling that something crucial had been missed in real time. Something small enough to ignore and large enough to destroy a life. The hair evidence, the single strand that linked the neighbor to Elaine's apartment, became both the strongest anchor and the weakest point, its scientific authority clashing with its contextual ambiguity, and debates about transfer, contamination, and coincidence filled pages of internal memos. Because science does not speak for itself, it must be interpreted, and interpretation always leaves room for doubt. As legal advisors reviewed the file yet again, they weighed not just the likelihood of conviction, but the broader implications of proceeding, the risk of setting a precedent where absence is treated as certainty, and in those discussions, Elaine's name was spoken with care. Because no one wanted her story to become a cautionary tale for the wrong reasons. Meanwhile, the suspect's life continued in the shadow of accusation, neighbors in his current building whispering, employers growing distant, a quiet erosion that mirrored the slow disappearance of Elaine's own future, and whether he was guilty or not, the stain of proximity followed him. Proof that suspicion alone can alter the trajectory of a life. Some detectives found themselves uncomfortable with that symmetry, the idea that two lives could be defined by absence, one by disappearance, the other by implication, and it forced them to confront an uncomfortable truth about justice, that it often operates in gradients rather than absolutes. Leaving scars even when it believes it is doing the right thing. Public interest flared again when a documentary crew requested access to the file, promising sensitivity and balance, and though permission was denied, the request reignited debate within the department about transparency, about whether telling the story more fully could help or harm, and about who truly owns a cold case once it enters the public imagination. Elaine's brother, now older than she ever became, declined interviews, but in a rare statement he acknowledged the complexity of the case, expressing gratitude for the renewed effort while admitting that certainty still eluded him. Because knowing who might be responsible does not replace the need to know what happened, where she went, how it ended. The building on the south side underwent another renovation, fresh paint covering old scars, new tenants unaware of the history embedded in the walls, and yet longtime residents claimed the place never felt entirely neutral again, as if the past had left a residue that renovation could not remove. A sense that the ordinary had once been breached and could be again. Urban planners talk about how cities absorb trauma, how neighborhoods adapt and continue, but Elaine's case illustrated how trauma can linger invisibly, shaping behavior in subtle ways, making people more cautious, more suspicious, less willing to dismiss oddities as harmless. Because once you know what silence can conceal, it changes how you interpret quiet. Detectives involved in the case admitted that they sometimes dreamed about it, not about violence, but about missed conversations, doors left unopened, questions not asked, and those dreams followed a familiar pattern, a moment where clarity seemed close, just out of reach, before dissolving. Mirroring the investigation itself. In training rooms, instructors emphasized the lessons learned, urging new officers to interrogate their assumptions, to look first at proximity, at routine, at the spaces people consider safe, and Elaine Potta's name became part of that curriculum. Her disappearance a silent instructor reminding them that the most dangerous blind spots are the ones created by comfort. Despite everything, there were moments when investigators wondered if they had gone too far, if the desire for resolution had pushed them to connect dots that resisted connection, and that doubt lived alongside conviction, an uneasy partnership that defined the case's legacy. Because certainty was always partial, conditional, vulnerable to challenge. As years continued to pass, the file remained untouched, its closure holding not because all questions were answered, but because there were no new ones left to ask, and that distinction mattered, marking the difference between resolution and resignation. Elaine Porter's story endured not as a solved mystery, but as an open wound carefully bandaged, present beneath the surface of official language, reminding those who knew it that some truths arrive incomplete, and some endings are declared not because they satisfy, but because time demands an accounting. And in that accounting, the phrase, "killer was living next door," persisted, stark and unsettling, a conclusion that felt both obvious and unbearable, because it suggested that the line between safety and danger is thinner than anyone wants to believe, sometimes no thicker than a shared wall. Sometimes no louder than a voice that was never raised, and sometimes only visible long after it is too late to change what happened. What unsettled the investigators most was not the theory itself, but how easily it fit once they allowed themselves to see it, how the pieces slid into place with a quiet inevitability that felt less like discovery and more like recognition. As if the truth had been waiting patiently for permission to be acknowledged, and that realization carried its own kind of dread, because it implied that the case had never been beyond reach, only beyond willingness. They began to talk about Elaine's disappearance not as an isolated act, but as an event embedded in routine, a crime that relied on predictability rather than chaos, because Elaine's life was structured, her habits consistent, her trust measured but present. And anyone living beside her would have learned those patterns effortlessly, absorbing them day after day until intervention required no improvisation at all. Cold case analysts revisited the concept of opportunity, stripping it down to its most basic elements: excess, timing, familiarity, and in Elaine's case, all three converged in a way that felt almost too neat: the neighbors sharing walls, schedules overlapping. Trust established through repetition rather than intimacy, a proximity that rendered suspicion unnecessary until it was unavoidable. The question shifted from could it have happened, to how long had it been possible, and that reframing cast a long shadow over the months preceding her disappearance, moments that had once seemed benign now tinged with menace, casual conversations in hallways reinterpreted as reconnaissance, small favors as rehearsals for intrusion, and the line between neighborliness and surveillance blurred until it disappeared entirely. Detectives studied the mechanics of disappearance, not in abstract terms, but within the constraints of that building, calculating how a body could be moved without triggering alarms, how sound could be masked by passing trains or the rumble of plumbing, how late-night activity could be explained away as maintenance, because in an old building, noises are expected, and expectation is a powerful anesthetic. They consulted experts in forensic architecture, specialists who understand how space influences behavior, and the consensus was sobering: the building's design favored concealment over exposure, long corridors, blind stairwells, a basement accessible from multiple points. All features that had once been considered mundane now reclassified as facilitators, silent accomplices to whatever had occurred. As the theory hardened, so did the discomfort within the department, because acknowledging that the answer had been so close meant confronting institutional blind spots, the tendency to search for danger elsewhere, to privilege the unknown over the familiar, and in internal meetings. There was an unspoken understanding that Elaine's case was not just about one disappearance, but about how many others might have followed similar paths into oblivion. The suspects' interviews were replayed yet again, every pause dissected, every inflection scrutinized, but time had sanded down any sharp edges, leaving behind a performance that was consistent if not convincing. And detectives debated whether that consistency was proof of truth or simply the result of a story rehearsed long enough to feel real. Without a confession, they were left to interpret behavior, and behavior, like evidence, can be misleading, because people do not always react to accusation in ways that align with guilt or innocence, and the suspect's calm, his refusal to crack, frustrated some and impressed others, reinforcing the sense that whatever had happened in 1988, it had been carried forward with discipline. Elaine's absence was felt most acutely in the quiet details: the life she never lived, the promotions she never received, the relationships she never formed, and investigators spoke of her not just as a victim, but as a trajectory cut short. A future erased in a way that numbers and reports could never fully capture. The city around the case had changed dramatically since 1988, neighborhoods transformed, demographics shifted, technology reshaped policing, but the core question remained stubbornly analog: what happens when everyone hears something but no one listens, when silence becomes communal? Reinforced by the belief that involvement is riskier than detachment. Community meetings held years later revealed a lingering sense of collective responsibility, residents expressing regret not for specific actions, but for a culture of disengagement, an unspoken agreement to stay out of each other's lives. And Elaine's case became an emblem of the cost of that agreement, a reminder that privacy can sometimes shield harm. Detectives found themselves grappling with a paradox, that the very qualities that made the building feel safe, familiarity, routine, predictability, had also made it vulnerable, and this paradox echoed in other cases, other neighborhoods, suggesting a universal vulnerability that transcended geography and era. In private conversations, some officers admitted that if the case had occurred today, it might have unfolded differently: cameras, digital footprints, instant communication narrowing the margins of disappearance, but even that comfort was fragile, Because technology does not eliminate opportunity. It merely reshapes it, and familiarity remains a potent disguise. Elaine's story continued to surface in professional journals and conferences, cited as an example of proximity-based risk, and each retelling added another layer of interpretation, another attempt to extract meaning from absence, because cold cases invite analysis the way wounds invite touch. Probing for pain in the hope of understanding. The suspect aged quietly, his connection to the case fading from public consciousness but never fully disappearing, and those who encountered him without knowing his history would never suspect the role he played in one of Chicago's most unsettling mysteries. A reminder that narratives are invisible unless revealed, and that truth, when delayed, often arrives stripped of spectacle. As the years stretched on, the distinction between fact and inference grew harder to maintain, and investigators became cautious about language, about how they spoke of the case, aware that words can solidify assumptions into beliefs, and beliefs into verdicts. Even in the absence of formal judgment, Elaine Porter's case lived on in that tension, between what could be said and what could be proven, between the need for resolution and the reality of uncertainty, and it was in that unresolved space that the case exerted its greatest influence, shaping how detectives approached other files. Other disappearances, teaching them to look first at what was closest, what felt safest, what seemed too ordinary to hide a crime. Because if Elaine's disappearance proved anything, it was that danger does not always arrive from the outside, sometimes it is already in sight, woven into the fabric of daily life, waiting for the moment when routine becomes vulnerability, and silence does the rest. Leaving behind a cold case that may be closed in name, but never truly laid to rest. As the years accumulated, the case began to exert a strange gravitational pull, drawing other unsolved disappearances into its orbit, detectives quietly comparing notes, wondering how many cold cases shared the same invisible architecture, crimes not defined by chaos or spectacle, but by patience, excess, and the willingness of a community to explain away discomfort as normal life. Elaine Porter's file became a lens through which investigators re-examined older cases, searching for the same markers: proximity overlooked, familiarity misread, silence misinterpreted as peace, and with each comparison, the realization deepened that Elaine's disappearance was not an anomaly, but part of a pattern that thrived on human hesitation. What haunted them was how little force the theory required: no dramatic abduction, no frantic chase, just a door opened to someone she recognized, a conversation that crossed an invisible line, a moment where resistance may not have felt necessary until it was too late, because violence, when it arrives through trust, often comes without warning. Former neighbors, now scattered across the city, spoke with a new urgency when contacted again, their voices edged with regret, recalling how Tide learned to tune out sounds that didn't directly involve them, how arguments behind walls were treated as private matters, how stepping in felt like an intrusion worse than ignorance, and these confessions formed a quiet chorus, not of guilt, but of recognition. One woman described lying awake at night years later, replaying a muffled exchange she'd once heard, a male voice sharp, a female voice low and strained, and at the time she'd rolled over and pulled the blanket tighter, telling herself it was none of her concern. A decision that followed her into old age like an unanswered knock. Investigators documented these accounts carefully, aware that memory is fragile, but also aware that patterns emerge not from certainty, but from accumulation, and the accumulation painted a picture of a building that had been louder than anyone admitted. A place where warning signs existed but were diffused across too many people to compel action. The suspect's proximity was no longer just geographic, it was psychological, embedded in the daily rhythms of the building, his presence normalized through repetition, and that normalization, detectives concluded, was the true enabler. Because danger that feels ordinary is rarely questioned until it is undeniable. In training seminars, the case was reframed not as a mystery of evidence, but as a study in human behavior, the ways people negotiate risk unconsciously, the social contracts that prioritize harmony over confrontation. And Elaine's disappearance was cited as the cost of those contracts when they are left unexamined. Public reaction evolved as well, moving from shock to introspection, community forums shifting their focus from who did it to how it was possible, and these conversations revealed a collective unease, a recognition that the case had pierced a comforting illusion. That safety is not guaranteed by familiarity, and that danger does not always announce itself with obvious signs. The suspect's denial remained consistent, and without legal resolution, the case existed in a gray zone that frustrated all sides. Because ambiguity resists emotional closure, it demands tolerance for uncertainty, a skill most people lack, and so the narrative hardened around implication. Filling the gaps with assumption, because assumption is easier to live with than not knowing. Elaine's story became a cautionary tale passed down not through official channels, but through informal networks, parents warning children, tenants warning roommates, stories adjusted and simplified, but always carrying the same core message: pay attention to what feels slightly wrong, even if it disrupts the comfort of normalcy. Detectives who had worked the case longest admitted that their relationship to it had changed over time, shifting from frustration to acceptance, and finally to responsibility, a sense that Elaine's legacy was not just about her disappearance, but about what her absence could teach if people were willing to listen. They spoke of the case as unfinished not because it lacked answers, but because it continued to ask questions about accountability, about the limits of justice, about how much certainty is enough to act, and those questions followed them into other investigations, shaping decisions in ways that could never be quantified. The building itself, now occupied by people who had no connection to 1988, continued to function as any other, doors opening and closing, lives intersecting briefly and then retreating behind walls, but for those who knew the history, every mundane interaction carried an undercurrent of awareness. A reminder that normality can coexist with something far darker. Elaine Porter's disappearance resisted mythologizing, not because it lacked drama, but because its terror lay in its restraint, a crime defined by what wasn't seen, what wasn't heard, what wasn't said, and that restraint made it more unsettling than any lurid headline ever could. As the cold case unit evolved, adopting new technologies and methodologies, Elaine's file remained a touchstone, a reminder that tools are only as effective as the willingness to question assumptions, and that progress in policing is as much about mindset as it is about science. The phrase, "killer was living next door," continued to echo, not as a definitive statement, but as a provocation, challenging listeners to consider how often danger is dismissed because it violates expectations, because it feels impolite to suspect, uncomfortable to confront, easier to ignore. In the end, Elaine's story persisted not because it was sensational, but because it was intimate, a narrative that unfolded within shared walls and shared silences, asking everyone who heard it to reconsider their own thresholds for concern, their own definitions of safety. And as long as those questions remained relevant, as long as people continued to live side by side without truly seeing one another, the case would remain alive in the spaces between certainty and doubt, a closed file that refused to stop speaking. Reminding the city that sometimes the most dangerous distance is no distance at all. By the 8th year after the case was officially labeled closed, something subtle but irreversible had happened. The story had detached itself from the paperwork and taken on a life of its own, circulating independently of facts, reshaped by memory and fear. Because once a cold case becomes a legend, it stops belonging to the investigators and starts belonging to everyone who sees themselves inside it. Elaine Porter was no longer just a woman who vanished, she became a stand-in for vulnerability, for routine, for the quiet risks embedded in ordinary life, and people who had never lived on her block, never walked her hallway, felt an unexpected connection to her story. Because it suggested that danger does not require chaos, only access and patience. Detectives noticed the shift in tone when they spoke at conferences or community events, fewer questions about evidence, more about prevention, about how to recognize threats that don't announce themselves, and Elaine's case was often the unspoken reference. Hovering behind discussions about neighbor disputes, shared spaces, and the thin line between privacy and isolation. The most unsettling realization was that nothing about the disappearance required extraordinary circumstances, no blackout, no citywide emergency, no breakdown of order, just a normal winter night in Chicago, people going to bed, radios playing softly, trains passing on schedule. A city functioning exactly as it was supposed to while one life slipped out of it unnoticed. Investigators revisited the concept of invisibility, not in terms of hiding, but in terms of being ignored, and Elaine's case exemplified how social norms can render certain signals invisible, raised voices dismissed as arguments, late-night activity explained as work, discomfort rationalized as misunderstanding, and each rationalization shaped away urgency until nothing remained to act upon. They spoke with sociologists who described this phenomenon as diffusion of responsibility, the quiet assumption that someone else will intervene, that if something were truly wrong, it would be obvious, and Elaine's disappearance stood as a brutal counterexample. Proof that harm can unfold incrementally, disguised as normality, until it is too late to interrupt. The suspect's continued silence fed this ambiguity, his refusal to confess leaving space for doubt to breathe, and without a definitive ending, the case resisted moral clarity, forcing those who engaged with it to sit with discomfort rather than resolution, a demand that most narratives avoid. Elaine's former co-workers, now approaching retirement, remembered the moment she stopped coming to work, the empty desk, the unanswered phone calls, and for them the case was less about mystery and more about interruption, a life paused and never resumed, routines broken without explanation. And that abruptness lingered long after details faded. In the neighborhood, informal memorials appeared and disappeared over the years, flowers left near the building entrance on anniversaries, notes taped briefly to lampposts, gestures that spoke to a need for acknowledgement even in the absence of answers. Because grief without a focal point tends to scatter unless given somewhere to land. Detectives who had moved on to other units still carried Elaine's case with them, not as an obsession, but as a calibration point, a reminder to slow down, to question assumptions, to look inward before outward, and they admitted privately that it had changed how they knocked on doors. How they listened to denials, how they weighed silence. The building's history became harder to access as records aged and residents turned over, and that erosion troubled investigators, because it mirrored the broader problem of time itself, the way it erases context, flattens urgency, and transforms once urgent warnings into background noise. And Elaine's case was, at its core, a battle against that erosion. Discussions about reopening the case one final time surfaced occasionally, driven by new leadership or renewed public interest, but each time they ended the same way: no new evidence, no new witnesses, no new ground to cover. And the reality settled in that the case had reached the limits of what could be known. That acceptance was not defeat, but it carried a weight that lingered, because it forced investigators to confront the uncomfortable truth that justice is sometimes constrained not by effort, but by timing. And that no amount of dedication can fully compensate for opportunities lost in the first hours and days after a disappearance. Elaine's story became part of the institutional memory of the department, passed down not as a caution against failure, but as a lesson in humility, a reminder that even with experience and intent, blind spots persist, especially when they are reinforced by social norms and collective silence. The phrase, "killer was living next door," continued to circulate, but over time it shifted in meaning, less an accusation and more a warning, a shorthand for proximity-based risk, a reminder that danger does not always come from strangers, and that familiarity can be both comforting and deceptive. For some, the case sparked changes in behavior, neighbors checking in more often, residents taking arguments more seriously, community programs encouraging dialogue rather than isolation, small adjustments driven not by fear, but by awareness, because Elaine's absence had become a quiet teacher. Yet for all these ripple effects, the core mystery remained intact: a woman who walked home and never arrived, a life reduced to speculation and implication, and that unresolved senta continued to exert pressure, reminding everyone involved that understanding does not always bring peace. Elaine Porta's disappearance endured because it refused to be simplified, because it resisted the neat arcs of crime stories with clear villains and satisfying endings, and instead offered something far more unsettling: the possibility that tragedy can unfold without spectacle, without witnesses, without a single moment that demands intervention. And in that refusal, the case remained alive, not in courtrooms or headlines, but in the quiet recalibrations of how people perceive their surroundings, how they listen to walls, how they interpret silence, because once you accept that a life can vanish next door without a sound, you never quite hear the ordinary the same way again. Years after the official closure, the haunting persistence of Elaine Porter's disappearance began to take on new forms, creeping into the corners of Chicago's collective memory, where stories of ordinary neighborhoods could no longer be told without the shadow of suspicion, and every quiet hallway, every locked door, every exchanged glance carried a subtle, unspoken question: could something like that happen here, unseen, unhört, unnoticed? Investigators revisiting the file noticed patterns they hadn't before, subtle intersections of time, routine, and opportunity that hadn't seemed significant at the moment, moments when Elaine had paused in the hallway to chat with a neighbor, or when the elevator had been unexpectedly crowded. And now those ordinary interactions were reframed as potential windows into the crime, reminders of how danger had once been cloaked in familiarity. The suspect's life, now decades removed from 1988, continued under scrutiny, yet without resolution, creating a tension that hung between certainty and conjecture, a silent testament to how criminal proximity can persist long after the event itself, coloring perceptions, altering relationships, making ordinary life feel thinner, more fragile, more charged with caution. Former co-workers of Elaine spoke about the day she vanished with a tone that mixed sorrow and disbelief, recalling the ordinary rhythms that were suddenly interrupted, the coffee she never brewed, the jokes she never told. The mundane routines that had once defined her presence now reduced to absence, a void both emotional and procedural, impossible to quantify. In the neighborhood, the building's residents remained quietly attentive, aware of the history embedded in walls and stairwells, the echoes of footsteps that once bore witness to unknown events, and the subtle vigilance that grew out of that knowledge became almost instinctual. A form of collective awareness that was protective, anxious, and unrelenting. As detectives conducted interviews with neighbors decades later, many described instances that, in hindsight, carried hints they had once ignored: a door left slightly ajar, a lingering voice in the hallway, an unexplained presence that faded too quickly to confront, moments of discomfort that, at the time, were rationalized as imagination or concern over nothing, but which, retrospectively, felt like pieces of a puzzle they hadn't been ready to see. The investigation into proximity-based patterns revealed how often trust and routine are weaponized, the subtle ways in which familiarity can be leveraged to diminish suspicion, and Elaine's case became a textbook example of how domestic spaces, seemingly safe, could facilitate harm. A lesson in how ordinary environments can conceal extraordinary violence. Experts in forensic timing and human behavior were consulted to reconstruct the moments preceding her disappearance, measuring likely paths, opportunity windows, auditory masking, and the flow of people in shared spaces, producing a chilling realization: the crime required no extraordinary measures. No theatrical break-ins, just patience and the silent cooperation of circumstance. The public, when re-engaged with the case, shifted focus from sensationalism to reflection, pondering the fragility of daily life, the invisible boundaries that separate security from danger, and the quiet lessons embedded in the tragedy, that silence is not always neutrality. That ordinary people can overlook extraordinary risk, and that sometimes the most profound vulnerability exists within the walls we trust. Detectives involved in the case admitted privately that Elaine's disappearance changed how they viewed proximity, routine, and human behavior, that they now approach everyday environments with a sharper awareness, questioning the ordinary, listening for the subtle, and resisting the temptation to accept comfort as certainty. In seminars and training sessions, the phrase, "killer was living next door," became a teaching mantra, less about accusation than about vigilance, less about punishment than about perception, a cautionary note about the dangers of overlooking what is right beside us, and the importance of observing what everyone else assumes is harmless. Despite the closure, Elaine's story continued to resonate in digital communities, forums, and true crime discussions, where theories, timelines, and interpretations flourished, illustrating the enduring fascination with cases that combine ordinariness and horror, and the persistent human need to make sense of absence when answers remain partial. The building where she lived remained functional but layered with history, ordinary to new residents yet subtly weighted with past events, a silent reminder that physical spaces retain memory, that walls and floors can carry witness in ways unseen, and that familiarity can never fully erase the echo of what transpired. Elaine Potta's disappearance remained a touchstone for reflection, a story that resisted tidy conclusions, compelling those who studied it to consider the delicate balance between trust and caution, between attention and indifference, and how easily that balance can be exploited without anyone realizing it until it is too late. The case persisted not because it was unresolved in legal terms alone, but because it existed in the interstices of perception, behavior, and memory, a demonstration that the consequences of a single night can ripple across decades, shaping both institutions and individuals in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. Even decades later, the chilling simplicity of the phrase, "killer was living next door," retained its power, serving as both caution and indictment, highlighting that the most significant threats are often not those that arrive from outside, but those that emerge from the spaces we consider familiar, safe, and ordinary, quietly challenging our assumptions about proximity, trust, and the hidden costs of human oversight. And so Elaine Porter's presence, though absent, persisted as an invisible force within Chicago's memory, a cold case not merely closed, but continually alive in the awareness it demanded, the vigilance it inspired, and the stark, unsettling reminder that safety is not guaranteed by the walls around us, but by what we see, what we hear, and what we choose not to ignore. By the 10th year after the official closure, the case had settled into something almost spectral, haunting both the neighborhoods of Chicago and the minds of those who had tried to solve it, a presence that could not be filed away, that resisted neat categorization. Because Elaine Porter's disappearance was not just a crime, it was a cautionary force, shaping how ordinary life was perceived in subtle, unsettling ways. Detectives reflected on the hours and days that had followed her disappearance, the initial search that felt urgent but uncoordinated, the witness interviews that had yielded fragments, each piece so small that collectively it almost seemed invisible, and yet now, with decades of distance, those fragments formed a lattice that spoke clearly about opportunity, excess, and the ordinary overlooked. The suspect's history was scrutinized with renewed intensity, old addresses, previous acquaintances, habits and patterns that might have gone unnoticed at the time, all examined through the lens of proximity, revealing how a life structured around observation, routine, and quiet manipulation could remain almost invisible, a ghost within a community. Neighbors who had once dismissed strange behavior now recalled details with a clarity born of hindsight, doors left unlocked at unusual hours, footsteps echoing when the hall should have been empty, conversations that seemed ordinary but carried a subtle tension. And the weight of those recollections was immense, because recognition came only after the fact, and after the fact was too late. The building itself became almost a character in the narrative, hallways and stairwells that had once been mundane now reinterpreted as instruments of concealment, spaces designed by accident to facilitate observation, and the layout of everyday life suddenly felt sinister in retrospect. As though architecture itself had been complicit. Psychologists consulted for insight described the banality of trust, the cognitive bias that causes people to assume the familiar is safe, and Elaine's disappearance became the definitive case study, illustrating how ordinary interactions, chit-chat in the hallway, a neighborly smile, a shared elevator ride can hide predatory intent in plain sight. The forensic team revisited old evidence, testing DNA, reanalyzing fibers, cross-referencing witness statements, but decades had eroded context, memories faded, and while the scientific data could connect dots, it could not reconstruct the invisible. The subtle manipulations and psychological patterns that had allowed the crime to occur unnoticed. The public remained fascinated, drawn not to gore or spectacle, but to the tension between normalcy and horror, to the dissonance that a killer could live beside a victim for months or years without detection, and to the uncomfortable reflection that proximity does not guarantee safety, and that danger often masquerades as familiarity. Elaine's family continued to navigate the liminal space between resolution and ambiguity, grateful that investigative work had at least provided a lead, yet aware that certainty, what truly happened, the details of that night remained elusive. And that the memory of absence can sometimes weigh heavier than the knowledge of fact. The phrase, "killer was living next door," took on a chilling universality, becoming shorthand for proximity-based risk, for crimes facilitated by trust, routine, and social blindness, appearing in seminars, articles, and internal police trainings. A constant reminder that danger can reside in the most ordinary places, unseen until it is unavoidably clear. Police trainers emphasized lessons drawn from the case, scrutinized the familiar, questioned assumptions, and recognized that ordinary patterns can conceal extraordinary acts. And for new officers, Elaine Porter's case became a touchstone, an example that intuition, observation, and attention to subtle irregularities are as crucial as forensic evidence. Even the media that revisited the story decades later avoided sensationalism, focusing instead on proximity, missed signals, and the psychology of ordinary life intersecting with extraordinary crime, a narrative that resonated precisely because it could happen anywhere, to anyone, quietly, invisibly, until it was too late. Urban planners and sociologists cited the case when discussing neighborhood dynamics, community awareness, and the importance of shared vigilance, noting how the absence of oversight, social or structural, can allow harmful behavior to persist unnoticed. Transforming Elaine's tragedy into a broader societal lesson about attention, care, and responsibility. Every detail that had once been mundane, the creak of a staircase, the hum of a heater, the pattern of deliveries, was now reinterpreted, a chilling reminder that normal life carries rhythms and vulnerabilities that, if unnoticed, can be exploited. And that awareness is both a tool of prevention and a burden of knowledge. Elaine Potta's disappearance had become both cautionary and haunting, a story about how ordinary life intersects with extraordinary evil, about how silence, indifference, and trust can create the conditions for harm, and about the enduring consequences of absence, not just for one life, but for an entire community. And so, even a decade later, the cold case continued to assert its presence, teaching, reminding, unsettling, proving that closure in legal terms does not always equal resolution in human terms, and that sometimes the most profound lessons emerge not from answers, but from the persistent, unyielding questions left behind. The city moved forward, buildings aged, people changed, routines shifted, yet the story remained embedded in the fabric of memory, a silent caution in every shared wall, every familiar neighbor, every ordinary day, because once you learn that danger can exist next door without detection, the ordinary is never quite ordinary again. Decades after Elaine Porter vanished, the echo of her absence lingered in ways that no police report, no cold case file, and no newspaper headline could capture, settling quietly into the consciousness of everyone who had brushed against her life or her neighborhood, leaving behind a tension that was invisible yet palpable, like the hum of electricity in old walls, persistent and unnoticed until you were forced to confront it. The suspect, now aged, lived a life outwardly normal, neighbors unaware of the role he had played, unaware of the calculated patience, the subtle observation, the ordinary routines that had allowed him to remain undetected for so long, and that normalcy was perhaps the most haunting aspect of all. Because it proved the terrifying truth, evil does not always announce itself, it often waits patiently, disguised by repetition, proximity, and trust. Investigators reviewing the final threads of the case remarked on the cruel efficiency of that patience, how years of minor, overlooked interactions could accumulate into opportunity, and how, in the absence of alertness, ordinary life could mask extraordinary harm. They spoke of Elaine not just as a victim, but as a catalyst for vigilance, her disappearance a permanent imprint on procedural thinking, an enduring lesson in human behavior and social awareness. Neighbors who had once shrugged at faint noises or unexplained shadows began recounting them decades later, small details now infused with significance, as if time had unlocked a new perception of the past, revealing the subtle architecture of danger embedded in walls, highways, and familiar routines. Every creak, every conversation, every glance that had seemed irrelevant became, in retrospect, part of the tapestry that had concealed her disappearance. Elaine's family lived with a paradoxical grief, mourning a life erased while wrestling with the partial closure of knowing who had been nearby when she vanished, yet never fully understanding the mechanics of that night. Their sorrow was compounded by recognition of how ordinary circumstances, neighborly trust, unremarkable routine, communal silence, had been manipulated into a perfect concealment, leaving them with more questions than answers, more what-ifs than certainty. Psychologists and criminologists studying the case highlighted the human factors that allowed it to remain unsolved for so long, the tendency to normalize the familiar, to dismiss anomalies as harmless, the diffusion of responsibility across multiple witnesses, and the unconscious bias to seek danger in dramatic scenarios rather than within familiar, comfortable spaces. Elaine's case became an example of how proximity can obscure judgment, and how ordinary life itself can facilitate extraordinary crimes. The building where she had lived remained functional, but for those aware of the past, it carried a silent tension, a historical weight that seeped into daily routines, reminding each occupant that space remembers, that proximity matters, that even walls and stairwells may have witnessed things we cannot see. And for investigators, each revisit, each report, each reflection on the case reinforced a lesson: safety is not guaranteed by familiarity, and trust must be balanced with awareness. Media coverage of the case evolved over the years, shifting focus from lurid speculation to psychological and sociological analysis, emphasizing the mechanisms of proximity-based crime, the social dynamics of indifference, and the structural and environmental conditions that permitted Elaine's disappearance. Her story became a cautionary narrative about the ordinary and the overlooked, illustrating that terror does not always arrive with noise or spectacle. In police training, her case became canonical, a benchmark in understanding domestic and proximity-related crime. New generations of officers were taught to consider access, routine, and the psychology of trust, to notice what others ignore, and to question the normal, for Elaine's disappearance exemplified the devastating consequences of the unseen and the unexamined. Yet despite all the analysis, reflection, and teaching, the emotional resonance of the case endured because of its simplicity and intimacy. A life ended not through grand gestures of violence, but through patient, calculated concealment, a crime that was unremarkable in execution, yet catastrophic in consequence, a killer who could walk beside the victim unnoticed, and a community that only realized too late how close danger had truly been. Elaine Porter's story remained alive in the echoes it left behind, in the hallways of old buildings, in conversations about vigilance and trust, in the quiet recalibration of awareness that those who knew her story carried into every new interaction. It was a story without closure in human terms, a caution without a definitive ending, a cold case that was legally closed but perpetually open in memory, influence, and the hard-won lessons it imposed on those who survived its wake. And so, even as years passed and Chicago changed, the story persisted, silent, invisible, unyielding, reminding the city, its investigators, and its residents that danger often lives quietly beside us, that trust is a fragile shield, and that ordinary life can conceal extraordinary tragedy until the moment when realization comes too late, leaving only the lingering, unsettling truth: the killer was living next door, and for decades, no one noticed. Even decades later, the city of Chicago seemed to hold its breath when the story of Elaine Porter surfaced. Buildings age, streets repave, lights shift, yet the memory of that winter night in 1988 remained like a faint, persistent echo, a tremor running through the daily rhythm of the city. New neighbors moved into her old building, unaware of the shadows they occupied, yet the walls carried the residue of a life interrupted, whispers of what had happened long before their footsteps echoed in the hallways. For law enforcement, the case had become more than a file, it was a living cautionary tale, a measure of how easily proximity can be weaponized and how ordinary life can mask unspeakable acts. Detectives reflected privately on the invisible architecture of the crime: doors left unlocked, trust unexamined, routine so normalized it concealed danger. They spoke of Elaine not as a victim alone, but as a teacher, her absence shaping how they understood the fragility of life, how they approached every neighborly dispute, every unexplained silence, every shadow in a hallway. Elaine's family continued to live with the paradoxical weight of partial closure, knowing who had been nearby, yet never knowing the intimate details of that night, never reclaiming the moments stolen from her life. The grief was layered, not just for Elaine, but for the lessons left unheeded, for the patterns that allowed a predator to thrive invisibly, for the social assumptions that permitted her disappearance to remain undetected. The suspect, now old and cautious, carried his secret like a phantom tether, moving through the world with a quiet consciousness of what he had done, and yet, the true horror lay in the fact that decades of normal life had allowed him to blend, unnoticed, while the memory of his crime festered in public awareness. It was a crime without spectacle, defined by absence, by what was not observed, and the ordinary facade made it almost ungraspable, almost mythic in its subtlety. Neighborhoods changed, but vigilance lingered. Former residents recounted stories, small details magnified by hindsight: a fleeting glance, a door ajar, a muffled voice in the stairwell, the quiet discomfort of things nobody wanted to investigate. Elaine's story became a framework for perception, the reminder that trust without observation is fragile, that silence can be dangerous, and that familiarity is not immunity. The media revisited the case sporadically, not for shock, but for the haunting resonance of its lessons. Columnists, podcasters, and criminologists emphasized the proximity factor, the banal evil that can hide in plain sight, the subtle ways a life can be erased while the world continues its routines, oblivious. Every retelling carried a ripple effect: listeners double-checked locks, neighbors paid attention, families reminded their children to notice the small, the quiet, the slightly off. Elaine Porter's disappearance had transcended the original crime. It became a meditation on human perception, on societal norms, on the limits of trust. Scholars cited the case when examining urban social patterns, cognitive biases, and the failure of communities to act, showing how collective indifference, however well-intentioned, can become an accomplice to tragedy. And still, despite all study, all reflection, all analysis, the core tension persisted. Elaine's life, frozen in that single night, remained a ghostly presence. Chicago moved on, but those aware of her story carried an invisible threat, a quiet caution sewn into the fabric of memory. Every ordinary evening, every neighborly interaction, every passing stranger became a subtle test of awareness, the reminder that proximity does not equal safety, that danger can live next door for years without detection, and that the ordinary is sometimes the deadliest camouflage. Her story refused finality. It demanded awareness, vigilance, and reflection. It reminded the city that evil often wears the guise of normality, that routine can conceal horror, and that closure on paper does not erase the lingering unease of what was almost unseen, almost ignored, almost allowed to vanish entirely. Elaine Porter remained both absent and present, a ghost in Chicago's collective memory, an invisible teacher of vigilance, a reminder that sometimes the closest threats are the ones we never suspect, that sometimes the walls around us are silent witnesses, and that even in the most ordinary moments, the line between safety and danger is narrower than we ever imagine. And as long as people walk familiar hallways, exchange polite smiles, and trust without question, the lesson endures: the killer was living next door, and the ordinary is never entirely safe. Even now, decades later, Elaine Porter's disappearance continued to ripple through the city like an invisible current, shaping the way neighbors watched one another, the way families whispered warnings, the way investigators trained their attention on subtle anomalies. Chicago had grown, streets realigned, buildings rebuilt, yet the story persisted, etched into collective memory, carried in hushed tones, in the pause before a door closes, in the wary glance exchanged between strangers who suddenly feel the weight of history pressing in. The suspect's proximity remained the most unsettling truth of all. Years of ordinary life, routines performed in quiet normality, had cloaked him in invisibility. No dramatic gestures betrayed him, no public suspicion had arisen. And that ordinary life became the measure of terror, the realization that the most dangerous people are often indistinguishable from everyone else, that evil can thrive unnoticed where familiarity breeds comfort, and that the walls beside you may conceal more than memories, they may conceal intent. Former neighbors, when interviewed decades later, confessed a haunting mixture of guilt and relief, guilt for the things they had ignored, relief that time had passed without repetition. They remembered fleeting moments, a shadow crossing a hallway, a muted argument, an unfamiliar car idling too long, and realized that the ordinary cues of concern had been present all along, waiting for recognition that never came. Elaine's family spoke rarely, but when they did, their words carried a heavy, lingering weight. They described her absence as a presence, a force that shaped how they moved through the world, how they taught vigilance, how they recognized the fragility of trust. They acknowledged that closure had limits, knowing the general circumstances could never restore what was lost, could never erase the vacuum left in a life prematurely interrupted. For law enforcement, the case became a study not only in criminal behavior but in human perception. Investigators discussed the ordinary as camouflage, how social norms and assumptions allowed a predator to remain invisible, how patterns of trust and community routines facilitated concealment, and how even highly trained eyes can miss danger that is mundane, subtle, and patient. It became a lesson in humility, in expectation versus reality, in the dangerous ease of familiarity. Elaine's story also entered the digital age. Online forums dissected the case, piecing together timelines, theorizing motives, debating neighbor behavior, creating a virtual archive of collective memory. The cold case, though officially closed, remained open in the hearts and minds of those who engaged with ET, and every recounting, every retelling, carried the same chilling refrain: the killer was living next door, hidden in plain sight. Sociologists noted the broader social impact. Neighborhoods became slightly more vigilant, communities slightly more communicative, parents taught children to observe carefully, adults learned to interpret subtle cues. Elaine's absence had created a new kind of awareness, a cultural caution embedded in everyday life, proving that even without resolution, tragedy can ripple outward, shaping human behavior in lasting ways. The city itself seemed to remember. Buildings bore the memory in creaking floors and cracked plaster, hallways seemed longer in quiet moments, and for those who knew the story, the ordinary sounds of life, doors opening, footsteps echoing, distant laughter, could carry an undertone of unease. It was a lesson that danger often moves quietly, patiently, and invisibly, and that the line between safe and unsafe is thinner than most dare to acknowledge. For those who studied the case professionally, Elaine's story became more than a cautionary tale, it became an ethical framework. How do we perceive ordinary spaces? How do we interpret subtle signals? How do we teach vigilance without breeding paranoia? The answers were never simple, and Elaine's disappearance served as a permanent reminder that human intuition is as fragile as it is essential, and that every moment of inattention can have irreversible consequences. And yet, despite all reflection, all study, all analysis, Elaine Porter's story retained a haunting simplicity, a young woman, living her life, unaware that danger resided so close, vanishing without spectacle, leaving only a void that grew heavier with each passing year. It was a quiet horror, an intimate terror, the kind that lingers in the ordinary moments, the kind that transforms trust into suspicion, comfort into vigilance, silence into a weighty presence. Her story closed no chapters fully, but it opened a permanent space in awareness, a space that asks, how well do we truly see the people around us? How carefully do we notice subtle signals? How easily can ordinary life be manipulated into a trap? And in that space, the phrase repeats endlessly, a chilling mantra that refuses to fade: the killer was living next door. Even now, when city streets hum with traffic, when apartment doors click shut, when neighbors greet one another with casual smiles, the story persists, invisible but persistent, a shadow stretching across decades, reminding all who know it that proximity is not protection, familiarity is not safety. And the ordinary can harbor the extraordinary in ways no one expects until it is far too late. Elaine Porter remains absent, yet impossible to forget. A life erased, a community unsettled, a lesson embedded. Vigilance is not optional, and awareness is the closest thing to justice that a cold case can offer. The city moves forward, but the story, quiet, relentless, haunting, never truly ends. The killer was living next door. And until people remember, until they observe, until they question what seems ordinary, the danger, and the memory, will remain alive, waiting silently in plain sight.